The text lit up on my phone screen while I was still at my office desk in New York. It was short, almost careless 6 words without a greeting, without a signature, just a verdict delivered cold. Just Mitch's family this year, keeping it small. My eyes froze on those words, and for a moment I felt as if someone had slapped me across the face. The sound of keyboards and printers in the other offices faded until all I could hear was the hum of the heater and the pounding of my own heart. My stomach seemed to drop right through the polished wood floor beneath me. Mitch's family. That was it. Not my name, not a question about my plans, not a moment of thought about where I might be spending Thanksgiving. Only Mitch and his picture-perfect family. It was as if I did not exist at all. I leaned back in my chair, staring through the glass windows out at the Hudson River, trying to blink the message away, as if it were some trick of the light. But it remained there, sharp, undeniable, and viciously clear. The words dug at me, reopening a wound I had carried since childhood, a wound that had been pressed down but never healed. My hands trembled, and in that trembling I remembered something I had tried so many times to bury. I was 12 years old again. The Dawson family dining room was bright with the glow of candles. Cousins and neighbors gathered, the smell of roasted turkey thick in the air. My brother Mitch was already carving the bird at my father's insistence, even though he was just 15. He was the golden boy, always the golden boy. Steady hands, confident smile, everyone watching with admiration. I had reached for the jug of cranberry juice, wanting to help, wanting to show that I could do something too, and the glass slipped. It splashed across the white tablecloth, staining it red like a wound opening in the middle of the feast. There was a moment of silence, and then my mother's voice cut like a knife. "You ruin everything, Claire." She stood her chair screeching against the wood floor, and before I could breathe, she grabbed a handful of my hair, yanked my head back, and pulled me out of the chair. My scalp burned with pain as she dragged me away from the table. Everyone watched. No one spoke. She shoved me into the hallway, her hand heavy against my shoulder, and hissed that I was embarrassing the family in front of guests. The door closed, and the laughter returned inside, as if nothing had happened, while I stood outside the dining room trembling and humiliated. That memory lived under my skin, and now this new message from my mother felt like the same scene replayed. I was still the child being yanked away, still the outsider, still the one not allowed a place at the table. The ache inside me sharpened, familiar and poisonous. For years, I had learned to swallow it, to convince myself it did not matter to build walls and bury myself in work, but each holiday text like this one cracked the foundation a little more. I stared at my phone, my jaw tight. I could have asked why. I could have pleaded for an explanation, begged for a seat, tried to remind her that I was her daughter too. But I knew better. I knew the script by heart. If I pushed back, she would call me dramatic. If I tried to explain, she would tell me I was overreacting. If I reminded her of my life, my work, my success, she would brush it away as meaningless compared to Mitch's quiet, steady local life in Indiana. That was always how it went. The golden son and the invisible daughter. I was not going to beg again. I typed a single word. Enjoy. My thumb hovered a moment before I hit send, and when I did, it felt less like surrender and more like a strike back. If they were cutting me out, then I would not fight for scraps. Not anymore. I set the phone down, exhaling hard, and looked out the window again. A cargo ship was pushing slowly through the water, lights glinting against the dark current, moving with its own power and purpose. That ship did not need anyone's permission to move forward. It reminded me of what I had told myself for years, but never dared to act on. I did not need their table. I could build my own. Still, the ache pressed against my ribs, raw and gnawing. Childhood memories lined up like soldiers waiting to strike. Birthdays forgotten. School awards ignored. Dinners where my words were cut off so Mitch's small triumphs could be praised instead. Each one was a scar. The message from my mother was not new. It was just louder, sharper, and impossible to ignore. The girl who had been shoved into the hallway at 12 still lived inside me. But now I was 29. Now I had built something on my own, far away from Fort Wayne, Indiana, far away from that suffocating dining room. I was no longer the trembling child in the hallway. I had my own life, my own means, and my own choices. The text had not broken me. It had lit a fuse. I picked up the phone again, not to call my mother, not to chase a place at their table, but to set something else in motion. My reflection stared back at me in the dark screen, older, harder, and ready. The girl they had tried to erase was not gone. She was right here, and she was about to make sure they remembered her name. Mitch was always the center of attention, the pride of the family, the one whose every move seemed to glow with importance. While I was the background noise, the extra piece no one really wanted, but tolerated out of duty. My earliest school memories were filled with the sound of his name spoken with admiration. Teachers praised him at parent nights, neighbors waved when he walked by, even the pastor at church called him a shining example for the youth group. Meanwhile, when I raised my hand in class or brought home a science fair ribbon, the recognition evaporated as soon as it reached our doorstep. I can still see it clearly, the way my mother's face would light up whenever Mitch walked in, and the way it would flatten back to indifference whenever my voice entered the room. The imbalance was so constant that it began to feel natural, as if the universe had divided love and attention unevenly on purpose. I remember my 15th birthday with a sting that still sits behind my ribs. I had been looking forward to it for weeks, telling myself that maybe this time would be different. My mother had promised to bake me a small cake. She even asked what flavor I wanted, and I told her chocolate with strawberry filling, hoping for something special. That day came, the family gathered Mitch sprawled on the couch, telling stories from football practice, everyone laughing. When Mom carried out the cake, it was small but beautiful to me, with frosting piped in careful swirls. For a moment, my chest swelled with hope. Then, as I leaned forward to cut the cake, my hand knocked over a glass of water, spilling it across the table. The laughter stopped. Silence thickened, and before I could even apologize, my mother's face twisted with disgust. She seized the little cake with both hands and threw it onto the floor, the frosting smearing across the tiles. Her voice was cold, sharp, unforgiving. "No one needs drama today, Claire." Her words carved me open. My father did not rush to stop her. He sat in his chair, arms folded, muttering that I should learn to be more like Mitch, quiet and steady. My brother smirked, the corners of his mouth twitching as if he were enjoying the spectacle, basking in the knowledge that once again he was untouchable while I was the family's punching bag. I remember kneeling on the floor after they left the room, staring at the ruined cake, my hands trembling, tears dripping onto the smeared frosting. That was my birthday gift. Humiliation wrapped in silence. The message was clear. I was not celebrated. I was tolerated. That pattern continued year after year. At dinners, whenever I tried to share something about my studies, my mother would cut in, steering the conversation back to Mitch, praising his charisma, his supposed leadership, his potential to expand Dad's shop. Even when I was accepted into advanced classes, even when I won regional science competitions, the news was greeted with distracted nods and a quick change of subject. I was invisible at my own family table. The pain of that invisibility grew heavier when combined with the small cruelties that seemed designed to remind me of my place. My mother often said I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too much trouble, and she said it in front of people who laughed awkwardly and pretended not to hear. My father used silence as a weapon, his disinterest more cutting than words, except on the rare occasions when he barked at me to stop complaining. And always, always, Mitch was lifted up as the model. When I protested, they said I was jealous, that I needed to learn humility, that I should be grateful for the roof over my head. But gratitude is difficult when every interaction feels like a reminder that you are the expendable one. There was another Thanksgiving. I was 16 then when I spoke the truth out loud for the first time. "Mitch is not perfect," I said quietly, frustrated by the endless stream of praise. The room froze. My mother's eyes went wide, and in front of neighbors and cousins, she stepped across the room and slapped me across the face. The sting burned my cheek, but what hurt more was the way everyone else looked away, their mouths tight, their eyes fixed anywhere but on me. My humiliation was swallowed by the silence of others. That night, I lay awake realizing that honesty was punished and pretense was rewarded. If I wanted to survive in that house, I had to swallow my words and keep my head down. Yet even when I stayed silent, I was reminded of my smallness. They forgot my birthday again when I was 17. I waited all day for a call or a card, and when I finally phoned home, my mother answered with a casual, Oh, no, was that today? She promised to make it up to me, but weeks later, the only thing that arrived in the mail was a Christmas card featuring Mitch and his family in matching sweaters. No note, no apology, just a photograph of their perfect smiles. I kept the card not because I cared for the image, but because it reminded me of how easy it was for them to erase me. Every forgotten milestone, every dismissal, every cold glance stacked up inside me layer upon layer of rejection. By the time I was 18, the weight of it made me feel like I was walking through life under a constant shadow. When I told my father that I wanted to go to Georgia Tech on a scholarship, his reaction was not pride, but anger. "Georgia is too far," he said, and slammed his hand against the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He hurled his glass against the wall near my head, shards scattering across the floor, his voice booming that I would never amount to anything. My mother stood beside him, nodding in agreement, her arms crossed. In that moment, I realized I could never win. No matter what I achieved in their eyes, I was always the lesser child, the inconvenient one, the dramatic daughter they never wanted. Those memories never left me. They formed the backdrop of every choice I made afterward. They explained why the 6-word message on my phone at 29 years old felt like a fresh wound. It was not new. It was the same old rejection dressed in different clothes. My family had been telling me I was unworthy since I was a child. That day in my office in New York, staring at the message, all of it came rushing back. The cake on the floor, the slap at Thanksgiving, the silence on my birthday, the glass shattering against the wall. All of it was stitched into the single word excluded. And though I had taught myself to swallow pain, to keep moving to build walls, I knew deep down that I could not let it pass this time. Something in me had shifted, and the neglected child inside me was demanding to be heard. When I finally left home at 20, I thought freedom would feel like stepping into sunlight after years in a locked room, but in reality, it felt more like stumbling into a storm without a map. I packed what little I owned into 2 suitcases and caught a bus to Atlanta because it was far enough from Indiana to breathe yet still within reach of the scholarship I had earned. The apartment I could afford was a cramped one-room space above a laundromat with peeling paint and a radiator that rattled all night like it was gasping for air. The mattress I slept on was second-hand and sagged in the middle, and most nights I fell asleep listening to the muffled voices of strangers arguing in the hallway. I worked 3 jobs at once, tutoring math at the university waiting tables in a diner that smelled perpetually of grease, and taking shifts stocking shelves at a grocery store just to keep the lights on. My meals were cans of chili or stale bread from the discount bin, and I learned quickly how to stretch $5 across an entire week. The city was loud and indifferent, and there were nights when I thought about calling home just to hear a familiar voice. But then I remembered the slam of my father's hand against the table and my mother's cold silence, and I shoved the phone back in my pocket. They had made it clear I was not wanted, and I was determined not to crawl back, begging. At 21, I met Jake, a man who seemed at first like a savior. He was charming with a grin that promised protection, and he told me I was different, that I was worth more than the people who had abandoned me. For a while, I believed him. He helped me with rent when I was short. He cooked simple meals. He said he admired my drive. I let myself lean on him because I was exhausted from carrying everything alone. But slowly the mask slipped. He began to criticize the hours I worked, telling me I cared more about my laptop than about him. He questioned every decision I made, framing it as concern, but his voice grew sharper, his jokes cutting deeper. The first time he raised his hand was during an argument about money. I had refused to let him take cash I had saved for tuition, and in the middle of a crowded bar, he slapped me across the face. The sound cracked through the room, the sting burned across my cheek, and my glass toppled from the counter. People stared, but no one stepped in. Jake leaned close, his breath hot and sour, and whispered that even my own parents did not care for me, so why would anyone else? The humiliation was worse than the pain. I stumbled out into the night, tears streaking down my face, the city lights blurring as I ran without direction. That was the night I promised myself I would never again allow anyone to own me. Not with fists, not with words, not with silence. I left Jake the next morning, moving my few belongings while he was at work. My hands shook as I dragged the suitcase down the stairs, but my resolve was solid. Alone again, I poured every ounce of energy into survival. I coded at night on a borrowed laptop, scribbling ideas for an app that could predict supply chain delays for small hospitals. By day, I still waited tables and stocked shelves, but by night, I was building something brick by digital brick, teaching myself the language of logistics. I failed more than once. The first prototype crashed constantly, and the second time, I nearly went broke after signing a contract with an investor who promised the world but delivered nothing but pressure. I stared at eviction notices, counted coins for bus fare, lived on black coffee and determination. Yet even in the worst of it, I clung to a single thought. I would not end as the forgotten daughter cast aside at her family's table. I would make something of myself so undeniable that they could not erase me no matter how hard they tried. Each rejection, each bruise, each sleepless night fueled the fire. By 23, though still broke, I had managed to secure a small team of believers. People who saw what I saw, that a broken link in a medical supply chain could mean life or death. They worked with me in borrowed office space, sharing instant noodles, tapping away on aging computers, driven not by salary, but by belief. When I looked at them, I felt for the first time a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with blood. We were building something vital, and though I was still haunted by the echo of my mother's voice calling me dramatic and my father's glass shattering against the wall, I carried those memories like armor. Every cruel word and violent gesture had taught me resilience. Every dismissal had taught me to demand space, and every lonely night had sharpened my will. I was no longer the girl kneeling by a ruined birthday cake. I was a young woman clawing her way through the dark, carving out a future one keystroke at a time. By the time I was 24, I was teetering on the edge of collapse, yet refusing to fall, pouring every ounce of strength into the small logistics company I had built, with nothing but determination and sleepless nights. I lived on energy drinks coded until my eyes blurred and sat through meetings with investors who looked at me like I was a child playing at business, but I refused to quit. Twice I nearly lost everything, once when an investor pulled out, leaving us scrambling to make payroll, and once when our servers crashed for a week, threatening to sink every client contract we had. Each time I held the line, promising my tiny team that I would bleed before I let them go hungry, and somehow we survived. When the pandemic hit, our app suddenly became indispensable, predicting shortages, rerouting deliveries, saving hospitals from chaos. Calls poured in, contracts doubled, and within a year, we were managing supply chains for dozens of hospital systems across multiple states. I hardly slept, but I no longer cared because I could feel the tide turning. At 28, the unimaginable happened. A Fortune 500 company offered to acquire us. The numbers were staggering. The ink on the contract felt unreal under my fingers, and when the transfer cleared, I stared at an account balance larger than anything I had ever imagined, larger than my entire family combined could dream of. More than $120 million. It did not feel like luck. It felt like proof that every insult, every dismissal, every violent outburst at home had been wrong. I had made something of myself in spite of them. Yet instead of flaunting it, I disappeared from their radar. I did not call home to brag, did not send photos, did not give them anything to twist into their narrative. I wanted peace, not their approval. With the money, I bought something I had dreamed of quietly for years, a place of my own that could never be taken a sanctuary. I found it in Malibu, a villa perched above the Pacific with glass walls that opened onto endless ocean, $5 million for stone and wood, shaped into serenity. The driveway curled past olive trees, the terrace spread wide for gatherings, the pool shimmered under the sun, and inside, every detail was chosen by me. Black walnut counters cut from old trees, a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, a master bedroom that opened to the sound of waves. It was not just a house. It was a declaration that I existed, that I mattered, that I could create beauty and safety with my own hands. I walked through the villa on the first night, the rooms echoing the smell of new paint, still sharp, and I felt something loosen in my chest. For the first time in my life, I belonged somewhere. No one could drag me away from this table because it was mine. As I stood on the balcony watching the sun sink into the horizon, I remembered a night 10 years earlier when my father had exploded after I told him about Georgia Tech. He had slammed his hand against the table, his face red, his voice booming that I would never amount to anything. Then he had hurled his glass of whiskey at the wall so close to my head that the liquid splattered across my cheek and shards rained onto the floor. My mother had stood behind him, arms crossed, eyes cold, and I had felt like nothing. That memory pressed into me even now, vivid as the salt air, but this time it did not break me. This time it fueled me. The girl who had once cowered while glass shattered was now standing in a villa built from her own success, her own grit, her own refusal to be erased. I kept the villa secret. I did not tell my parents, not Mitch, not anyone from Indiana. I hired a small team I trusted to maintain it, but beyond that no one knew. It was not about rubbing it in their faces. It was about reclaiming control. For once I had something that was entirely mine, untouched by their gaslighting, their comparisons, their violence. I could host whoever I wanted. I could sit at the head of the table. And though I lived in New York most of the year for work, every trip to Malibu reminded me that I had carved out a sanctuary with my own blood and determination. At night, I would sit by the pool, a glass of wine in hand, listening to the ocean and thinking of that girl who had knelt on the floor beside a ruined birthday cake. I wanted to tell her that she would grow strong, that she would prove them wrong, that she would someday stand here with no one to pull her hair or slap her face or silence her voice. That villa was the embodiment of every promise I had made to myself. It was quiet power. It was survival turned into triumph. And though no one in my family knew it yet, the existence of that villa meant that when the time came, when they cut me out again, I would not simply vanish into the shadows. I would rise with something greater, something undeniable, and I would finally have the stage on which to show them that the invisible daughter was invisible no more. The message from my mother still echoed in my chest days later. 6 words that had carried years of rejection in their weight. But this time the silence that followed was not surrender, it was planning. I scrolled through my contacts until I found Aaron, my cousin on my father's side, someone steady and fair who had never joined in the cruelty. I called him that night, my hands trembling slightly, though I did not want to admit it. He picked up on the second ring, his voice warm with surprise. "Did you get invited this year?" I asked, already knowing the answer. There was a pause, then he sighed. "No," he said, "apparently it is just Mitch's family this year. First time in decades. Even Grandma is furious." My jaw clenched. They had not only cut me out, they had sliced away the rest of the family like dead weight, as if only Mitch's perfect little clan mattered. The thought made something sharp ignite inside me. What if we did something else, I asked. Aaron chuckled without humor. "Everything is booked. Where could we even go?" I took a breath and let the words fall heavy. "I have a place, a villa in Malibu, big enough for everyone." Silence, then a low whistle. "Are you serious, Claire?" "Completely. You get here, I will handle the rest." He promised to talk to his wife, and within an hour he texted back. "We are in." That was the moment the plan crystallized. For years, I had swallowed humiliation, endured gaslighting, absorbed every slap and insult. But this time, I would not be erased. I would not sit outside the door listening to their laughter. I would host my own Thanksgiving, not with bitterness, but with defiance wrapped in warmth, an open door for everyone they had cast aside. I spent the next day sketching out arrangements with the precision of someone building a fortress. The villa had 5 guest bedrooms, but I knew I needed more. I contacted nearby rentals, booked cabins, and arranged transport. I called a local chef with Appalachian roots, someone who cooked with heart, and hired her to prepare a true family-style feast. Each room in the villa I prepared personally. I ordered baskets filled with personal touches, bourbon, and smoked almonds for Uncle Ray crossword puzzles, and a magnifier lamp for Aunt Leia toy trucks, and dinosaur gummies for the twins. I wanted no one to feel like an afterthought, no one to feel the way I had always felt. For the first time in my life, I was not just reacting to rejection. I was shaping something better. The memory of past wounds rose as I worked. I saw again my father's face twisted in rage as he pushed me against the wall at 20, his voice booming that I was worthless. I saw my mother's cold eyes as she slapped me at 16 in front of the neighbors, her handprint burning into my cheek while everyone pretended not to notice. I felt again the sting of Jake's slap in the bar and the weight of humiliation that followed. Those memories no longer crushed me. They fueled me. They reminded me why I was doing this. I was not begging for inclusion. I was declaring my own table, my own rules. Show up and be welcomed. Ignore me and be forgotten. As the RSVPs rolled in, my phone buzzed constantly. Cousins messaged with excitement, aunts offered to bring pies, uncles volunteered to help smoke turkeys. Grandma Evelyn called me directly, her voice steady and sure. "Tell me when to pack," she said, without hesitation. That sentence pierced me deeper than any wound because it carried something I had longed for my entire life. Someone choosing to come to me not out of obligation, but out of respect. I walked through the villa that evening, picturing laughter bouncing off the glass walls, the long table filled with candles and steaming dishes, children running across the terrace, and I realized this was more than a dinner. This was justice in disguise. This was healing turned into action. I remembered Thanksgiving years earlier when my mother had slapped me for daring to question Mitch's perfection, how the room had frozen and then thawed as if nothing had happened. In that moment, I had felt small, powerless, voiceless. But now, I was not that silenced girl. Now, I was the host, the provider, the one with power. The villa would not just hold a meal, it would hold a reclamation. My chest tightened with anticipation. The storm of years of rejection was about to break, but this time I was not the one being swept away. I was the one steering the course. The first car pulled into the driveway just after noon on Thanksgiving Day, and I felt my pulse quicken as I stepped out onto the villa's terrace to greet them. Aaron climbed from the driver's seat, his wife Kayla following with their 2 kids, and his eyes widened as he looked up at the glass walls and the sweep of the Pacific beyond. "Holy," he whispered, "this is yours." I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips because for once I did not need to explain. I did not need to justify. "Yes," I said simply, "it is mine." Within an hour more, cars arrived, cousins carrying casseroles, uncles unloading coolers, children running across the lawn, squealing with excitement. Aunt Leah stepped from her car, clutching her famous apple pie, tears welling in her eyes as she hugged me and whispered that no one had made her feel this welcome in years. Uncle Ray clapped me on the back, pressed a bottle of bourbon into my hand, and told me I had always been the dark horse and he was proud I had proven them all wrong. With each arrival, the villa filled with live voices echoing in rooms that had stood empty too long, the air thick with the smell of roasting turkey and cinnamon from the pies. I moved from guest to guest, pouring drinks, pointing out rooms, making sure everyone felt cared for, and the more I gave, the more I felt something inside me begin to heal. By 5 o'clock, the villa was alive in a way I had only ever imagined. Laughter spilling from the great room, children racing down the hallway, someone strumming a guitar on the back deck while others lit a fire pit near the pool. For the first time, I was not on the outside looking in. I was the center, the host, the one who had created the gathering. When the table was finally set, it stretched nearly the length of the great room. Candles flickering, bowls and platters filling every space, glasses clinking. There was no kids' table, no hierarchy. Everyone sat together equal, welcomed, fed. As dishes passed hand to hand and conversation rose and fell, I caught sight of Grandma Evelyn at the far end. She motioned for me to come closer, her eyes shining. I leaned down and she gripped my hand, her voice low but steady. "You gave us back Thanksgiving," she said, and those words landed deeper than any insult my parents had ever hurled. For a moment, I could not speak, my throat tight, but I squeezed her hand in answer. Around us, the room glowed with warmth, the fireplace crackling, the ceiling echoing with conversation that was real, not forced, not laced with comparison. I looked down the line of faces, people who had been brushed aside, just as I had, and none of them looked bitter. They looked home. Yet even as joy swelled inside me, old memories surged like ghosts demanding to be acknowledged. I was 16 again, daring to say aloud that Mitch was not perfect. The room freezing, my mother's hand flashing across my face, the sting of the slap burning as neighbors averted their eyes. I remembered standing there, my cheek flaming humiliation thick in my throat, as my mother hissed that I was ungrateful and dramatic. That humiliation had shaped me carved lines of silence into my soul, and now here I was hosting 30 people in a villa that belonged to me. The contrast struck like lightning. That slap had once silenced me, but this table roared louder than any blow could. I raised my glass halfway through the meal, not with a formal toast, but with a quiet declaration. "I am glad you are all here," I said simply, and the table erupted with nods and murmurs of agreement. No one needed grand speeches. The act itself was enough. Dessert came and went, children tugged at toys, cousins dozed near the fire, and for the first time I felt a weight shift inside me. I was not invisible. I was not unwanted. I was the one who had opened the door and made a place for everyone. The warmth of that recognition pulsed through me, almost painful in its intensity, as if my body did not know how to hold it. Later that night, after the guests had settled into their rooms and cabins, I stepped out onto the balcony alone. The Pacific stretched dark and endless, the stars scattered above the air, cool against my skin. I thought of my mother's text, those 6 words meant to erase me, and I smiled into the night. She had no idea that her rejection had given birth to this, to a gathering larger and warmer than any Thanksgiving she had ever presided over. I had not begged for a seat at her table. I had built my own. The morning after the feast, I awoke to the sound of my phone vibrating non-stop on the nightstand, the screen flashing with missed calls and texts, the names of my mother, my father, and Mitch stacked one after another like an accusation. For a moment, I let it ring, sipping coffee in the quiet library with the fire crackling, listening to the laughter of cousins as they prepared for a hike by the lake. I had never felt more at peace yet. The buzzing phone reminded me that the storm I had outrun was now pounding at the door. Finally, I picked it up and pressed accept. My mother's voice came through sharp and angry. "Daniel, why did you not tell us everyone is talking about your house, your event? The pastor even mentioned it in his sermon." I did not flinch. "You said you were keeping it small," I answered, "so I made other plans." "That was not about you," she snapped quickly. "We just thought you were busy, always working. Mitch's family was easier to coordinate." Her excuses slithered through the line, twisting reality the way she always had. "You are blowing this out of proportion," she continued, dramatic as always. My chest tightened, the familiar sting of gaslighting pressing against old wounds, but I had learned too much to let it choke me now. I set the phone on speaker, and from the next room I heard the creak of Grandma Evelyn's chair as she drew near the fire. "Put them on speaker, Claire," she called, and I obeyed. Dad's voice joined the line, gruff and defensive. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "You are making us out to be villains." Evelyn's voice cut through like a blade, steady and fierce. "Robert, Judy, you have ignored this girl her whole life, treated her like a burden, acted as if she were some problem to be hidden. Now you are shocked that she built something without you. Be grateful she still let the family in." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. My mother tried to interject, her voice faltering. "That is not fair. We never meant to hurt anyone." Evelyn did not waver. "What is not fair is how you slapped her in front of guests, how you pulled her hair from the table, how you let Robert shove her into a wall at 20 years old while you stood by. Do not deny it. I saw it." My father's breath hissed through the line, his words clipped. "Stop exaggerating." Evelyn's tone sharpened. "Exaggerating. I was there. I watched you throw a glass at the wall near her head. I watched Judy tell her she was too dramatic while blood dripped from a cut on her arm. The truth spilled into the open memories I had carried alone, now named by someone else, undeniable. My hands trembled, but this time it was not with fear, it was with release. The silence on the line stretched my parents struggling to summon a defense. Finally, my mother whispered, "I did not mean to. I was just trying to keep peace," but her words sounded hollow, brittle, collapsing under their own weight. Evelyn pressed on. "This is not about a dinner. This is about who you choose to see and who you choose to erase. You never saw Claire not once, and now you reap the consequence. I leaned forward in the leather chair, letting the words hang, letting the weight settle. My parents said nothing more, perhaps stunned that their cruelty had finally been dragged into the light. I ended the call without another word, setting the phone down on the table and staring out the window at the lake. For the first time, I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I had carried for nearly 3 decades. They could no longer twist the story, no longer convince me I was overreacting, no longer make me doubt my own memory. The truth had been spoken aloud and witnessed, and I was no longer alone in it. The day went on without them. Cousins returned from their hike, children built forts in the hallway, Aunt Leia set up a puzzle on the card table, and the villa pulsed with life. I walked through the rooms hearing laughter echo off the glass walls, and though my phone buzzed again with more missed calls, I let it sit. I would not chase them. I would not explain. For once, the gaslight had burned out, and I was left standing in the clear light of day. That night, after the calls had gone silent, I sat in the library with only the crackle of the fire for company, the villa finally calm after a day of noise and joy, and I stared at my phone, knowing it would not remain quiet for long. By morning, the messages began to arrive one by one, each carrying a familiar blend of guilt control and manipulation disguised as reconciliation. Mitch's name appeared first, his text short stripped of punctuation, a tone that carried more distance than warmth. Did not expect that, but I get it. I stared at the words for a long time, remembering every moment he had smirked when I was humiliated, every time he sat silently while Mom and Dad tore me down. Part of me wanted to believe him, to accept the possibility that he finally understood, but the brevity of his message felt like a performance, not an apology. An hour later, another message arrived, this one from my mother. "Can we come visit sometime, just the two of us?" I read it twice, my hands tightening around the phone. It sounded so simple, so polite, but beneath it I heard the familiar undertone, the expectation that I would once again open my door. Forget the bruises, erase the slaps, pretend the years of silence had not happened. My chest tightened as I remembered being 20, standing in the kitchen as my father shouted at me, his hand gripping the collar of my shirt, slamming me against the wall so hard my shoulder bruised purple. My mother had watched, arms folded, and when he left, she had whispered, "If you take this outside, do not call yourself our daughter." That memory burned behind my eyes as I read her text, asking for a quiet visit. No mention of those years, no acknowledgement of her complicity, just a casual request, as if history could be folded neatly away. The next message came from my father, his words flat and clipped. "Looks nice. Proud of you." No question mark, no warmth, just a comment thrown into the void as if I were a stranger he had bumped into at the grocery store. I remembered him hurling his glass of whiskey at the wall near my head when I was 18, shards scattering across the floor, his voice booming that I would never amount to anything. Now he was proud. The irony twisted like a knife. I set the phone down, my mind a storm of memories, every attempt they had made to erase me flashing against every attempt now to rewrite the story. They wanted to return not because they had changed, but because the narrative had shifted and they were no longer in control. My heart pounded as I asked myself if I should answer, if I should grant them entry into the world I had built. But the answer came quietly from the sound of footsteps behind me. Grandma Evelyn shuffled into the room, her blanket draped around her shoulders, and she smiled at me softly. "Do not let them take this from you," she said, her voice steady. "You built this." She lowered herself into the chair across from me, the firelight dancing in her eyes, and I knew she was right. Only she received an immediate reply when she texted asking if she could stay a few more days. "You can stay as long as you want." I wrote back without hesitation, and when I told her, she smiled and said, "This spot has my name on it." That moment felt more real than any of the empty messages from my parents. I remembered again the night my father had pushed me into the wall, his voice shaking the room, and how my mother had turned away. I remembered Jake raising his hand in that bar, telling me no one would believe me. I remembered Mitch standing smug while I knelt beside a ruined birthday cake. All of it collided with the reality of now, where cousins filled the villa with laughter, where children built forts, where Grandma Evelyn sat by the fire, safe and cherished. The texts from my parents and Mitch no longer carried power over me. They were attempts to rewrite history to smooth over scars without ever admitting to the wounds. I refused to let them. That evening, as the cousins planned another hike and Aunt Leia set up another puzzle, I turned my phone face down and let it buzz unanswered. For the first time, I felt no urge to chase their approval. Instead, I felt the weight of freedom, heavy but liberating like armor forged from years of fire. Their words could no longer trap me because my life had already outgrown them. The villa stood as proof, the laughter of family stood as proof, and the steady presence of Evelyn by the fire stood as proof. I would not erase my pain, but I would not let them erase it either. December arrived with a sharp chill in the air, and with it came the question I could not ignore: what would happen if I allowed my parents and Mitch into the villa for Christmas, if I looked them in the eyes, after all the years of silence and violence, after the texts that rang hollow after the phone call where Grandma Evelyn had stripped away their excuses. Part of me wanted to slam the door and never open it again, to let them stew in the absence they had created. But another part of me longed for proof. Proof that I was strong enough to face them without fear. Proof that I could control the narrative instead of being controlled. So I sent the invitation simple and unadorned, no warmth but no malice either. A few days before Christmas Eve, their SUV pulled up the long driveway, Mitch behind the wheel, his wife beside him, my parents in the back. I stood at the door waiting, my arms crossed my face, calm though my heart pounded. Mitch stepped out first, looking up at the villa with narrowed eyes, skepticism and envy wrestling on his face. "You really built all this?" he asked every square inch. "Yes," I answered evenly every square inch. My mother and father climbed out more slowly, their eyes darting around, unable to settle, as if the ground itself did not belong to them. They walked inside, and I watched their shoulders tense, watched the unease ripple through them. Dinner was simple by design, family-style plates of roast beef and potatoes, glasses of wine, no fancy silverware, no show. The conversation began stiff small talk about weather and traffic, Mitch mentioning his shop, my parents nodding distractedly, their eyes roaming the villa as if trying to find cracks. Finally, I leaned forward, my voice steady but sharp. "Do you remember I asked when you slapped me in front of guests, when you forgot my birthday, when you told me I would never amount to anything?" My mother froze her fork, clattering softly against her plate. My father's jaw clenched, his voice rising low and angry. "We did what we had to," he said, as if abuse could be recast as discipline, as if humiliation could be reframed as guidance. The old rage in his eyes flickered, but I did not flinch. Mitch sat silent, his eyes darting between us, his mouth pressed into a line. For once, he did not leap to their defense. The silence stretched heavy and raw. My mother whispered, "I did not mean to hurt you," but the words sounded thin, a brittle attempt to paper over cracks in the foundation. I kept my gaze steady. "Meaning is not the point," I said. "You did hurt me." Again and again. And you never stopped. My father shifted uncomfortably, muttering that I was dredging up the past, but his voice lacked conviction. Grandma Evelyn, sitting at the end of the table, cleared her throat, her presence once again anchoring the room. "It is not dredging," she said. "It is truth. And truth has waited long enough." No one argued. The air was thick with things unsaid, but the power had shifted. For the first time, I was not the one cowering. I was not the one silenced. After dinner, as plates were cleared and people rose from the table, Mitch lingered near me. He did not speak at first, just extended his hand. I took it cautiously, and before I could pull away, he said quietly, "You did good. Claire, real good." It was not much, but it was more than he had ever given me a small crack in the armor of rivalry. My father shook my hand stiffly. My mother gave me a half hug, neither apology nor affection, just a gesture that spoke of uncertainty. They left that night in silence, their figures small against the vastness of the driveway as the SUV pulled away. I stood by the window watching snow begin to fall, the flakes swirling in the cold night air blanketing the villa in white. Behind me, the fire crackled the room warm, the tension ebbing slowly. For once, I did not feel bitter. I did not wish for them to change or for the past to be erased. I simply felt the weight of truth sitting solid in the room, unshakable, undeniable. The final test had not been about them. It had been about me, about proving that I could stand in their presence and no longer shrink, proving that their power over me had dissolved. The girl who had once been pushed against a wall was gone. In her place stood a woman who had built a life of villa, a family of her choosing, and who could stare her parents in the eye without flinching. New Year's Eve arrived with a quiet that felt different from any other holiday I had known, a quiet that was not the silence of rejection but the calm. After a storm has passed, a calm earned by surviving. The villa still hummed with life from family who had chosen to stay, cousins lingering for the holiday children darting across hallways, Grandma Evelyn settled near the fire with her blanket and her puzzles, and Aaron coordinating hikes and bonfires. Yet even amidst the noise, I found myself stepping out to the balcony alone. As night fell, a glass of wine in my hand, the Pacific stretching dark and endless before me, the air sharp with salt and possibility. My phone buzzed again with messages. Cousins thanking me for the best Thanksgiving in years, others promising to return next year. The group chat Aaron had created, now alive with jokes and plans, its title bright and bold, Thanksgiving 2.0. I scrolled through, smiling at the photos of kids roasting marshmallows, uncles playing guitar, aunts laughing, and I felt the glow of something I had never known as a child, a family that felt chosen and real. Then I set the phone down because this night was not about digital echoes. It was about the weight of the present moment. I thought about my parents and Mitch, about the half apologies and stiff gestures at Christmas, about the years they had erased me, and I realized I no longer carried the same hunger for their approval. They were still on the outside circling, trying to decide if they could re-enter the orbit of a daughter they had dismissed, but whether they did or not no longer mattered. The consequence had already arrived. By casting me out, they had lost their grip, and in losing it, they had revealed that I could build something stronger without them. Their table no longer defined me. My villa, my feast, my gathering did. I raised my glass toward the ocean, my voice quiet but steady. "Here is to the girl they tried to erase," I whispered. "You made it." The words hung in the air, carried off by the wind, and I felt the knot that had lived in my chest for nearly 3 decades loosen and dissolve. I turned back inside and watched Evelyn doze peacefully by the fire, the flames reflecting in her silver hair, and I knew she was the anchor that had kept me tethered to truth when gaslighting threatened to drown me. She had spoken aloud what I had been forced to carry in silence, and because of her, the cycle had broken. That was the clear consequence my parents now faced. They had been exposed not in a public courtroom, but in the court of family memory, their abuse named, their silence judged. They could no longer twist the narrative. Every cousin, every aunt, every uncle who had sat at my table now knew the truth, and with that truth came solidarity. No one asked why my parents were not present at Thanksgiving. No one pressed for reconciliation. They understood instinctively that this gathering was not about who was missing, but about who showed up. In the weeks that followed, I watched the shift continue. Cousins texted about planning cabin themes for next year, Aaron suggested rotating dishes, and even the younger ones chimed in with excitement about forts and hikes. It was becoming a tradition rooted not in obligation, but in choice. That was something my parents could never manufacture no matter how tightly they clung to Mitch's curated perfection. They had tried to control the narrative by exclusion, by cutting out everyone except their golden son, and in doing so, they had lost the very family they thought they owned. That was justice enough for me. On New Year's Eve, as fireworks popped faintly in the distance over the water, I thought back to every scar, the birthday cake smashed on the floor, the slap at Thanksgiving, the glass hurled at the wall, the push against the hallway plaster. The nights of silence when my calls went unanswered. The voice of Jake telling me no one would believe me. Each memory, once heavy, now felt lighter, not gone, but transformed into fuel that had built this moment. I walked through the villa, each room glowing with warmth, and I felt pride, not just in the walls, but in the life filling them. The consequence of their rejection was not my destruction, but my creation. They had thought they could erase me. Instead, they had carved me sharper. At midnight, I returned to the balcony, the stars stretched endless, the waves pounding steady, and I lifted my glass again. Here is to survival. Here is to building. Here is to never begging for a seat again. The girl who had been shoved out of the dining room at 12 now presided over her own table, and that table was wide enough for anyone who came with honesty and care. That was the final truth, the final symbol. No more chasing approval, no more waiting to be noticed. The door was open to those who showed up, and it would remain closed to those who had chosen silence and violence. That was the rule, now the consequence laid bare. I breathed deep, the air cool and bracing, and smiled into the dark. For once, the future did not feel like a question. It felt like a promise.